Today, we're going to be showing you how to take the bearings out of your longboard wheels and replace them with new ones. For those of you that are new, let's review the basics. This is your deck and the part of the longboard you stand on when you ride. These two things are your trucks with wheels on either side of them. Inside the wheel, there are two bearings and some spacers, which are all held on to the axle with a nut. Got it? Okay, let's get started. To change the bearings in your longboard, first you're going to want to get your longboard, a hammer, a flathead screwdriver, a ratchet with a socket that matches the nut on your wheel, and 8 new bearings. First, you'll want to lay out a paper towel because the grease and dirt around your bearings and wheels can stain your surface. Once you've done this, you may also want to protect your hands as the grease and dirt can stay on your hands for a while. Next, you'll want to take your ratchet and set it to take off the nut. Rotating the ratchet to the left should work the nut off. You'll want to hold the board with your other hand while you're doing this to make sure that it does not move around. Once you have the nut off, you'll want to set it aside. Next, there may be spacers on the axle between the nut and the bearing. If there are, you'll want to take those off and set them aside with your nut and keep track of them. Next, you'll want to slide the wheel off the axle and set it on your paper towel. There may be another spacer between the wheel and the end of the axle, and you'll want to keep track of that one too with your nut. Next, you'll want to check inside your wheel to see if there's a spacer in between the two bearings. If there's not a spacer in between the two bearings, you can use your flathead screwdriver, place it through the first bearing, tilt it, and touch the inside ring of the second bearing with the end. Next, you'll use your hammer to tap it twice, rotate the wheel a quarter of a turn, and tap it 2 more times. You'll continue doing this until the bottom bearing works its way out. If you do have a spacer in between the two bearings in your wheel, you may not be able to get your screwdriver all the way through to the second bearing. In that case, you'll want to take your screwdriver, push it through the first bearing, and tilt the screwdriver to help the bearing start coming out. You'll want to rotate as you tilt. And eventually it should come out. Next, if you do have a spacer in between the two bearings, you'll want to take that out and set it aside with the nut. Now that you have the first bearing out, you can use your thumbs or your screwdriver to push out the second bearing. If it's hard to get out, you may need to use the hammer and the screwdriver to work it out. Once you have them both out, you'll want to wash the inside of the wheel with soap and water. Once you've washed the inside of the wheel, you'll want to make sure that you dry it off well. Once you've dried your wheel, you'll want to take your first new bearing and place it into the wheel. You should be able to push this in with your thumbs, but if you can't, or it's difficult, take one of your old bearings, place it on top of the new one, and use the hammer to tap in the new bearing. This should seat it. When it's seated, it should be flush with the outside of the wheel. Next, you'll flip your wheel over and put the spacer back in. The spacer should be in the wheel so that if it's lined up, you can pass the axle through the bearing and the spacer. Next, you're going to set your second new bearing into the wheel as well. Again, you may be able to push this in with your fingers, but if not, you can use one of the old bearings to help seat it. You may accidentally push the other bearing out. If so, just be sure to put the spacer back in and push the previous bearing in. Once you have the bearings the new bearings into the wheel, you'll want to put a spacer, if you had one, back onto the axle. Next, you'll want to slide the wheel onto the axle, and if you have an interior spacer, use the screwdriver to line it up with the axle. Once you have the wheel completely on, you'll want to put one of your spacers back on if you had any. Next, you'll want to take the nut and start it by hand. If it's difficult to get on, you may have it cross-threaded, in which case you'll want to take it off and try again. The nut should go on smoothly by hand. initially. Then you'll want to take your ratchet and set it to put the nut back on. Hold the board and tighten the nut down. Just when the nut's tight against the bearing, you'll want to turn it back about half a turn. Once you've done this, you'll want to check to make sure your nut is not too loose or too tight. If the nut is too loose, it may move along the axle. If it's too tight, when you spin the wheel, it will not continue to spin and will slow down quickly. This wheel is continuing to spin, which means the nut is not too tight, and it does not have significant movement along the axle, so it is not too loose either. You'll want to repeat these steps for the other 3 wheels on your board to replace all of your bearings.